Thank you, Philanthropy Roundtable, for the opportunity to present Moral Courage, How to Teach Diversity Without Division. I'm Irshad Manji, founder of Moral Courage College, which has partnered with Let Grow, the nonpartisan not-for-profit that promotes independent thinking and emotional resilience in young Americans. We believe that the way diversity is widely practiced and taught in schools today is bad for young people, bad for inclusion, and bad for a more perfect union. The good news is we've got a powerful alternate approach that lives up to diversity's promise and America's ideals. But before getting into that, let me bring you a bit of my own backstory. My family and I are refugees from Uganda. We were expelled by the military dictator Idi Amin, who proclaimed that Africa belongs only to Black people. Being brown-skinned, we suddenly did not belong, and Idi Amin sent us fleeing on pain of execution. As refugees, my family and I landed in this part of the world where I grew up attending two kinds of schools, the secular public school of most kids, and then on top of that, every Saturday, the Islamic religious school, known as the madrasa. That's where I began asking simple but apparently inconvenient questions. One Saturday, my so-called teacher instructed us that we Muslims must not take Jews and Christians as friends, which confused me because the Quran, Islam's scripture, makes clear that Jews and Christians are fellow people of the book. So I questioned the teacher, only to be told that either I believe or I get out. And if I get out, I'm out for good. I remember thinking, get out for good? There is a God. But I also remember thinking, just because I'm leaving this building does not mean I'm leaving God. There's more than one way to practice faith, and some ways are in fact healthier than others. Well, the same can be said for practicing diversity. Some ways are healthier than others. Here's what I mean. The intolerance so often exhibited by religious extremists, I'm now seeing replicated by ideological extremists. No doubt, the Capitol Hill insurrectionists and QAnon conspiracy theorists come to mind. Yet something more comes to mind too. Something that's sweeping institutional America. Puritanism in the name of diversity. Dishonest diversity. The kind that excludes different viewpoints. The kind of diversity that divides. Let me illustrate. A year and a half ago, I moderated a large student roundtable on diversity. The students did not obsess about race. Instead, they zeroed in on diversity of thought and the lack of it in their schools. One self-described liberal student said, I want my friends from conservative families to feel that it's okay to express themselves. A second student chimed in, exactly, I want to learn from them. Whereupon a third student piped up, yeah, I don't have all the answers. What these students were doing in real time is busting stereotypes about conservatives. It's unjust to label a whole group close-minded. They were also busting stereotypes about liberals. It's unjust too to label a whole group close-minded. After all, these students clearly had open minds, and they were liberals. Ultimately, they were busting stereotypes about young people. It's not true that they've all bought into cancel culture. In fact, studies done by YPulse, America's leading youth research firm, show that Gen Z is hungry for viewpoint diversity. You know who's not yet open to allowing it? Many of their educators. Which is why I and my partners at Let Grow have innovated a series of resources aimed at educating, well, first engaging, then educating educators, and showing them the how of teaching diversity without division. We call this how the moral courage method. By the way, notice that moral courage is aspirational and positive language. We insist on being for a new path to diversity, one that includes diversity of viewpoint. We don't announce ourselves as being against the current framework of group grievance. And you know why? Because behavioral science demonstrates that making your target audience feel threatened only leads them to become defensive and resistant. I mean, think about it. When culture warriors tell you that you're the enemy, are you motivated to listen? Me neither. We can't put a stop to us versus them if we mimic us versus them in our approach. So let's talk about our approach to teaching diversity without division. The moral courage method starts with our common humanity, not a common enemy. It treats people as dynamic and ever evolving, not as static categories or commodities to be labeled. It celebrates individuality, since everyone has a unique backstory. It emphasizes that listening is as much a leadership skill as speaking. The moral courage method replaces the us versus them paradigm with relationships that build cultures of curiosity and caring, not cultures of compliance and shaming. It teaches that everyone has some power, so that having less power than another is not the same as being powerless. Above all, it uses neuroscience and cognitive psychology to show that each individual has an ego, that the ego is powerful, and that when we speak truth to that power, we're far more likely to be understood by others because we're taming our ego in order to understand others first. These are the principles that we embed in the moral courage line of resources. Our most exciting and scalable resource will be released this spring. It's an on-demand online course for educators that'll teach them to teach honest diversity. Diversity that moves beyond group labels, creates brave spaces for free thought and speech, incentivizes students to hear rather than fear different perspectives, reveals empathy to be a much smarter, more productive emotion than feeling offended, and prepares young people to be innovative in solving the problems that they care about. Let me offer you a few glimpses of the course.
She is the founder of the Moral Courage Academy, whose latest book is Don't Label Me, Irshad Manji. When you say don't label me, who are you aiming that at?
I'm actually aiming it at everybody who in this us versus them era is hurling labels and categories at each other.
As a person who's been leading diversity initiatives in independent schools now for years, I can tell you that moral courage is definitely and truly the next step.
We role-play brave conversations about real-world issues that make people online and off scorn each other.
Where are your facts? How do you know that so many people are on your side?
A lot of educators today assume that to create safe spaces, students should not hear views that are uncomfortable or in any way offensive. That's not the kind of safe space that the moral courage method aspires to create. For us, a safe space means that students are free from immediate judgments, not from challenging views.
First of all, if everyone agrees on something, doesn't mean it's right.
If we're really going to educate, then students are going to have to get comfortable in their discomfort.
I'm just so shocked, honestly, by this conversation.
Innovation doesn't happen with safe ideas and instant agreement. It's a mix of questioning, listening, and being agile, not fragile, when you encounter obstacles like this. I'm playing the role of someone who won't listen.
That possibility is there.
Minuscule.
But that possibility is there.
Minuscule. I'll tell you why all of this matters. First of all, round of applause. What we'll be practicing as part of the moral courage method is honest diversity. Diversity of perspective, not just diversity of appearance.
I've really found that moral courage isn't something that you just learn in high school and then that's it. It's really something that should be a piece of character that you take on with you for the rest of your life.
At the very end of that video, you saw the word products with an S, plural. So if you'd like to learn more about our other products, ask me to explain during the Q&A. We spent 2020 creating and packaging resources whose levels of impact build one upon the other. 2021 is the year to distribute and apply these resources. What kinds of results can be expected? We'll get into that in the deep dive. But allow me to share one of my all-time favorite stories as I wrap up this talk. At an independent boarding school in the Chicago area, the diversity director received a complaint from 2 Mexican students. The students felt offended that one of their peers, an American girl, always wore a necklace featuring Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, who is near and dear to the hearts of many Mexicans. These boys accused the girl of cultural appropriation, a trendy label for the supposed crime of stealing from another culture. Now, I had taught the moral courage method at this school, so the diversity director knew not to treat students as fragile, but instead as dynamic and evolving. She brought them together to figure out for themselves how to resolve this conflict. Well, the offending girl had the moral courage skills to walk into the conversation with confidence, but not arrogance. She asked the offended boys why they felt that way. She learned that the boys, deeply religious Catholics, had been repeatedly taunted at school as future priests and pedophiles. So when they saw a white girl wearing a miniskirt and wearing Our Lady of Guadalupe, they assumed she was appropriating Mexican culture to become rather to make a fashion statement and a mockery of the Virgin Mary. In that context, the girl said she could understand where these boys were coming from. She explained, though, that like them, she's a faithful Catholic. She then added that she's a feminist too, and she didn't think she should be prejudged by the length of her skirt, or for that matter, by the color of her skin. She pointed out, and I quote, "You don't know me until you know my story, just as I didn't know you guys until you opened up about the bullying you've experienced." The boys apologized for jumping to conclusions about her. Now, she could have left it there, but she had to be honest. The very idea of cultural appropriation seemed misguided to her. Having built trust with these boys, she diplomatically observed that they were wearing jeans. It turns out, she said with a smile, jeans are an American invention. The first ones were made in California during the gold rush. I wouldn't say you guys are guilty of cultural appropriation because you wear jeans. It just means that we have something more in common. We all admire American culture for one reason or another, just as we all love something about Mexican culture. Our Lady of Guadalupe. They exchanged hugs, and for the rest of the academic year, they prayed together. Plus, the girl was so grateful for the moral courage mentorship she'd gotten the year before, she wanted to pay it forward. So she taught the boys how to outwit future bullies by transforming the bully's anger into non-defensive dialogue. Now, of course, not every dialogue will go swimmingly. Still, it's amazing what can happen when we know the skills to turn disagreement, even resentment, into opportunities for engagement. So, Philanthropy Roundtable donors, The next time you are labeled anti-diversity because you will decide what and who to fund, you can ask a sincere question. Could you please clarify what kind of diversity I'm against? Is it dishonest diversity, which is all about labeling people? Or is it honest diversity, which is about understanding people? Because you're right, if it's dishonest diversity, I don't embrace that. But I passionately advocate honest diversity. How about you? I'd like to understand. Speaking of conversations, I hope you'll now join me for the deep dive. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I am happy to say that we have two people joining us for the deep dive who are very well experienced with moral courage and the moral courage method. The first is Raquel Majeski, who she will introduce herself a little bit more in just a second. But Raquel is one of those educators who is so passionate about the whole human being growing that she's actually done moral courage at her school, Lawrence Academy in Massachusetts, now going on 3 years. And as far as I know, has no intention to stop. Maybe after this deep dive and my line of questioning, she'll rethink. But that being said, that is one of the reasons that I decided that Raquel would be a great voice to have in the deep dive. And the other person whom we have is a young woman named Alexis Dejesus. She is a sophomore at Wesleyan and an alum of Moral Courage College. And I have to tell you that among the things I love, both about Alexis and about Raquel, is that they really are independent-minded, each of them, which means I have not chosen them to be part of this because I think they're going to mimic everything or even anything I say. If I wanted ideologues, who are like really committed to the cause and would not contradict me in any way, I would have gone searching elsewhere. The reason I think it's important that we hear from both of these individuals is precisely that they embody what it is to live in a pluralistic society, that they and I, on any given issue, might actually disagree, but this is key. They are willing and I am willing to give each other the space to hear one another out. And so I might wind up challenging, they might wind up challenging me, or maybe it'll just be a love-in. I have no idea. But they are individuals first, and I want you to see what that looks like in the context of moral courage. So, Raquel, let me start with you. Since, part of the moral courage method is getting to know one another's backstories, tell us a little bit about your story.
Sharon, thank you for that great introduction. I was like, I'm a teacher that embodies all of this. Oh, me.
You.
I know. So I've been doing diversity work well over 10 years. And I've been doing diversity work in the South, in the independent school, in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And now I'm here as the assistant head of equity and community life at a boarding school in Groton, Massachusetts. So we're about 30 miles outside of Boston. And it has blossomed and bloomed. And I think, Irshad, you really hit it. At the core of my work is helping students grow, period. And that looks like math, and that looks like science, but that looks like navigating life outside of a bubble of education. And so I'm so grateful to have done that work for over a decade, and I don't have any plans in stopping anytime soon. So that's me professionally, but I think personally, what I appreciate, and I don't want to go too far, but what I appreciate about this work is the opportunity to look beyond various labels and ways in which folks identify themselves, if that makes any sense. So I know for me, I was a teenage mom as and I'll share just, I had my oldest child when I was pregnant at 14, had him the day after my 15th birthday. Wow. Crazy. Just the story wasn't great, and now I know they have shows like young teenagers on MTV and that sort of thing. But I was directly impacted by preconceived notions of self and misjudgment. And still to this day, I'm 39 with a 24-year-old, and folks like, what does that mean? Like, how is that possible? So I was a victim of judgment. So it's always been a part of my life work to allow students to hold true to who they are without that judgment, without that label, without shame, without blame, without guilt, and really allow them to blossom. And so for me, both professionally and personally, my work is at the core of everything I do and what I believe.
Yeah, it seems to me, just in telling us that story, Raquel, and thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that you've defied, people's assumptions about you.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know what? But only because I was allowed not to be confined to a label, I think. So there's that part of it. Yeah. But often those relationships where I've been able to show and be my authentic self, not perfect, sure, but transparently me, those relationship building opportunities is what led me here. So absolutely.
Wow. Beautiful. Alexis, one of the nice coincidences, and I say coincidences because this is not the reason I invited you to be part of this. One of the nice coincidences is that Ms. Majeski was your teacher. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. So I'm from New York, and I was raised basically by a single mother because my father was deported at a very young age. And before I was actually being taught under Miss Majeski at Lawrence Academy, I was a part of an educational advanced program called Prep 9 here in New York. I'm a part of Continuum 28. And from a very early age, my mother was discovering that I was gifted in terms of just being a very intelligent young woman. And so she would always tell me, be a leader. Do not be a follower, be a leader. You have the potential to really be great. And the second thing she would always tell me is to never fear anything. There's no reason to. And that being said, when I was around middle school, we decided that it was best for me to go to Groton, Massachusetts, in the middle of nowhere compared to my large city. And, when I arrived there, I was like one of the only darker females or women in the class. And it wasn't until later on that Miss Majeski came on board. And Miss Majeski was one of those people at Lawrence Academy, and just the experience at Lawrence Academy in general, right? Being at a PWI was where I started to find the importance of really having a voice. And it was the first time I also understood what my mom kept saying: be a leader, don't be a follower, be a leader, don't be a follower. And I was like, what does that mean? And the more I continued to study at Lawrence Academy and continue to just navigate the world as a young adult, I started to notice that the most important thing, or something that I'm very passionate about, is looking at the emotional and functional elements of any room, and being able to understand how everyone's so different, yet we're so common. And with that, I felt like I'm on a path of really understanding how to be a leader that listens and is willing to take the struggles of other people to create solutions to really advance the space and community that I'm a part of. Mm-hmm. And, that was the interesting thing, the most interesting thing about being at LA, and even talking to Ms. Majeski now, is seeing my growth in terms of my voice and my commitment to staying a leader and not being afraid of, joining spaces where I might think that I'm going to be perceived in a way, which is also my own perceptions.
Yeah.
And it is also very weird because at Lawrence Academy, right, there's different places of different classes, like different people of different classes. And I've mainly grown up when I was younger, I was very poor. And then I was in middle class. And then with COVID, I was actually like homeless, and now I'm back to living on my own in an apartment in New York with my mom every once in a while. And so it's also crazy because with the differences in class, I also felt some type of a struggle at LA with my voice and being able to basically assimilate with others. But I also noticed how common we are despite class and despite where we're coming from. And I think Lawrence Academy was a beautiful experience because it taught me the importance of being able to use your voice despite the fear of being misunderstood or misinterpreted because of either a stereotype or statistic per se that you might fit very easily.
Right, right. One of the things that I'm seeing as you're talking is how much of an impact Ms. Majeski has had on you, which frankly makes me all the more proud, Raquel, that you're one of those teachers who really gets the value of moral courage in education. Which brings me to my next question for you, Raquel. So Lawrence Academy, like every other school in America, amplified its diversity and inclusion efforts last year. And anti-racism was and remains all the rage. So you were asked to justify choosing moral courage over anti-racism. Why did you go with moral courage?
Oh, you're shot. Yeah, right. And I think like I was asked to justify that decision, and I'm grateful that I'm at an institution that understands and trusts me. It's simple. And so to plain speak it, moral courage is a strategy. Okay. And so when we talk about the philosophy of thoughts and ideas, even 10 years ago, there was buzzwords and there will always be buzzwords. And the buzzword that in light of George Floyd that was dancing around was anti-racism. And that philosophy, and like other philosophies, are tried and true. That's true. And there's research and there's information, but when you're looking at it through an educational lens, how do you implement a big picture philosophy? What are the action steps? What are the tools? And so when I was even doing my own research, because so many things changed. There was so many different movements that were taking place over the summer, and institutions had to react. And for me and for my institution, the logical step was to take whatever the philosophy was and to put it into practice. And so moral courage, I find time and time again, is exactly that. It answers the how. So we want to be anti-racist. We want to be equitable. We want to be inclusive. We want to be a community of belonging. Okay, so how do we do that? And when you look into the research and you look into that philosophy, they're providing you the why, which is important, but moral courage not only provides the why, but it also provides the how. And even without the movement of anti-racism, you even hear in what Alexis is sharing, she used listening. I can listen, the premise of listening. And at the core of what moral courage provides is that tool and strategy so that folks like Alexis and as many other students we have can go out into various places and be listeners. Be active listeners without shame, without blame, and to create a dialogue that invites people in and not tear people out or keep people apart. And so it was an easy decision. And once I was able to communicate it like that, whether that was to, my head of school or parents or students, it was no push at all. It was, got it. Now let's implement it and do the work.
So I'm going to push back just a little bit on something you said. I think you and I may actually have a different point of view about this. You mentioned, quote, we want to be equitable. I have to tell you that the idea of equity doesn't sit well with me because, and I know you've heard this before, to me, equity suggests same outcomes, regardless of the effort put in. Whereas equality suggests a parity of opportunity, that everybody should have ready opportunity. Now, what they choose to do with it will help determine who has really earned their success and who has kind of just felt entitled to it. What do you think about same outcomes versus same opportunities?
I like that. And what I'm hearing is the opportunity to equip. And like we always use the toolbox example, but I'm going to go there. Like, I want my students in my community to be able to have whatever tools they need to get to work and be global citizens. So if I want them to have the hammer, the screwdriver, the nail, and I want them to be able to choose which tool will work best for whatever the occasion is. And so possibly I'm looking at equity as simply that I want to give them a tool. I want everyone to have tools so that they can navigate the complexity of whatever they're faced with once they leave my institution.
Gotcha. So to be clear, and we haven't even talked about this before, you personally do not define equity in terms of outcomes. You define equity as equal access to the various tools that young people need to acquire to navigate the complexity of our big, messy world. Is that right?
Yes, because and the reason why I'm comfortable, and I would need to like ponder that a little bit, but yes, because we know that we're living in an evolving society and place and space. Not only is language evolving, the way we're approaching diversity work, the way we're approaching recognizing people is constantly changing. So what works even in this month may not be the tools and what's going to work in 3 months from now. But at the end of the day, I need to be fluid and agile enough to provide that equal access of those tools for my students. So yeah, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay, that's interesting. I like that. Alexis, so I mentioned when I was introducing you that you're an alum of Moral Courage, right? Do you remember, you said something when you were asked as an 18-year-old, what has Moral Courage done for you? And I remember being blown away by how you answered. I told you that I was blown away, so I'm hoping you remembered roughly what you said back then. What did you say?
I think I was even younger than 18. But I think I said something along the lines of even if something was very uncomfortable, like if a conversation is very uncomfortable, or you're in a space where you have something to say, but for some reason the setting is making it very hard for you to do so, even if it's in a non-productive way, you should do it anyway. And I remember feeling that way after the Moral Courage event and thinking, the worst thing that happens if I share my opinion is either someone disagrees with me, someone says no, or I'm getting like rejections of some sort, right? But that wouldn't kill me, right? If anything, that would make me stronger and give me more tools in my toolbox to be able to further have complex conversations, right? And I remember taking this back from actually an exercise that you did where we were acting out a complex conversation between two people from very different places of the world, with very different histories. And I realized, every time I meet a stranger, whether or not I mean to, there's automatic assumptions that might rush into my head, right? But the only thing that's really going to allow me and that person to really know, like, wait, what is your story, is, vulnerability. And being willing to express opinions, backstories, whatever it may be, to allow the other people around you to get to know you. And Moral Courage, if there's one thing, growing up in New York, you're very much taught to mind your business, right. And which is fine. But I also think, it's so beautiful that we're on an earth with so many human beings, with so many different stories, so many different memories of laughter, of sadness, that we're not more willing to talk to each other and express that, even if it might cause discomfort. I don't think uncomfortability is always a bad thing. If anything, it should be embraced. And so, yeah, I think that's what that's what I said back then. Which is really
Back when you were, 17 years old, you were probably younger than 18. So 17 years old and in your, elder state, right? You actually said something along those lines. Now you know why. I was like, who is this young woman? And, how do I get her to become a moral courage mentor to other young people? And we're going to get to that in due course. But I want to stay with you, Alexis, for just one more minute, because what you have just described seems to me a lot more of a mature mindset than I see among a lot of people who think of the young people who think of themselves as progressive these days, right? You just said, for example, that, what's the worst that can happen if someone disagrees with me? Okay, I hear no, or somehow I'm rejected, but that's okay. That just gives me something more to think about and, makes me a stronger individual. That's not how a lot of your generation think.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of kids today are offended by being disagreed with. And in fact, if I understand correctly, you yourself have been targeted for cancellation simply because you insist on having an open mind. Yeah. Tell us more about what you've experienced in that regard and how you've kind of stood up to the fear. I know your mom told you don't be afraid, but these are really primal fears of belonging, right? And we all have those fears of being judged. So tell me what you've experienced in that regard and why you insist on remaining, open-minded and morally courageous.
Yeah. I'd be lying if I said that every moment where there was an opportunity for me to be morally courageous, I took it, right? Because of that fear, and as much as I've been told, don't fear things, it's just normal, right? For me, especially now that I'm in a developmental stage where, I'm starting to question my social position as an adult. And that's very scary to do on your own, especially when you're first going to college and there's no one really around you holding your hand, trying to tell you this is correct, this is wrong, this is, but I think, even when I was facing cancellation, because I'll give an example. There was one moment where I was walking with some friends and basically I was talking about the desire to make friends with different people from wherever. Like I just wanted to open up like my friendships and to really start to experience campus, and one of my friends got really annoyed because they were like, would you want to be friends with like white people? And I was like, yeah. And they were like, why? And I was like, why not? And it seemed like a very weird question to me because, I understand, but I think the reason why I was so adamant, I was so confused is because I thought it was really weird to assume that the kids growing up in my generation who happen to be white, right, are resembling the same behaviors as people of the past, right? And I think if we stay in that thinking, how would we ever move forward? And to another extent, it was sort of like, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, let's be morally courageous, let's be open-minded. It's also because I think about universal healing, right? And I am a young woman of faith where, I've spent a lot of time alone. And doing that, part of my hope and where my motivation and my strength comes from is my belief in God. And part of that and my belief in that is understanding that no matter what, unconditional love at its core is the thing that I hold most. And due to that, I don't believe that I should reserve my love, my kindness, or any of that to someone else because of my own assumptions of them, because of things we can't control, right? Like I can't control that I am, a Black queer woman. A lot of intersectionalities there, a lot of possible, social problems, but, I was born this way, right? And everybody else is born in their own right, has their own story. And so I think it's unprogressive for me to say that I'm not going to give someone a chance to possibly be one, like some of my best friends have been people I would have never thought to ever meet. And imagine that, like, imagine all of the memories, all of the love, all of the laughter, even the sadness that I withdrew from myself because of my closed-mindedness, right? And in terms of, like you were saying with my generation, I think I would say I do disagree with some of the people in my generation, because we have this misconception, since, you know, we were the first born into the age of technology, you know. We feel as though it's super easy. Look it up on Google and you should know why this is wrong and this is correct. And I say, you know, yes, but it's also, there's multiple layers, right? What about the principles and the morals that the older generation hold true? And I think it's quite disrespectful, in a way, because we have more access to knowledge, to sort of think that the knowledge that we think is true is the one that upholds the truth, right? And I think there are things that we can be taking away and we should be taking away from the older generation, as well as, and so I think the misconception is we divide and we say, you know what, I'm right because I'm on this side. When in reality, it should be, whether or not you're in this side or in this box or in many boxes, it should be an exchange of information, of, you know, emotions, because I don't think not one thing is like one dimensional, right? I think everything has many layers, many reasons as to what makes it beautiful, what makes it complex. And I think even when we're talking about society and how we interact with one another, we need to understand that it is going to have multiple layers. Many different people look many different ways. When we are talking about solutions, we're including so many other people, so many different things. And with all of those differences, no one can sit here and be like, I'm right. Because if that's the case, it's never going to actually progress. And I would say that is the challenge with my generation, where it's like, we want to make change really badly, but we're not understanding that it has to be an exchange, right? Like, no one likes to be told, yo, you are wrong and you have to do what I'm saying. You know, you're instantly gonna get defensive. But you know, if you're saying, hey, like, I see where you're coming from, but can I share my experience as well, and maybe you can come to a middle ground? I think that's way more effective. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to hear that you think you have something to learn from older people, because you know what? I'm a lot older than you are, Alexis, okay? And if I had your wisdom when I was 20 years old, I'll just leave it at that. Raquel, good job with Alexis, by the way. Raquel, Alexis talks about the need for exchanging, right? Exchanging thoughts, opinions, viewpoints, emotions, etc. You're doing exactly this as we speak with a book study that you're conducting with not just other school faculty, but with the entire community in Groton, Massachusetts. I don't mind saying it's a study, a formal study based on my book. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that, you know, in my latest book, I tell some pretty hard truths. Not everybody wants to hear these things. And given how liberal Groton is, I'm curious to know how these hard truths and the way you're teaching them have landed. How have they impacted on the participants in Groton, Massachusetts?
Yes. So Groton is in Massachusetts, and so it's an extremely liberal town. And it's it's a luxury and privilege to oversee the diversity task force in the town. And so our work, Irshad, really, from the time of implementing and doing the Moral Courage College with the students, we have structured our strategic plan around moral courage work. So there is some level of foundation there. But again, in light of our current climate, whether you're liberal or not, folks are playing that zero-sum game, right? And that was very much in the air of the work. And because we are a boarding school, we pull from different communities. Mm-hmm. While we're located in Groton, Massachusetts, I have a lot of kids from New Hampshire, a lot of families who would identify as being more conservative, and they were curious about what we were going to do in communicating out our diversity initiatives. And so the tool that we use, and we're reading Don't Label Me, the reason why for me, and it was twofold, that novel was so important, that text was so important, was because it gave a clear foundation of what we were doing internally on campus. But for all of the folks who participate, and so we're pulling from alums of every decade, just about going back to the 70s, community members who identify differently. So some identify as being liberal, some as being conservative. Parent community who are just really curious about what we're going to do. And again, they're spending $60,000 plus to send their kids here. And so they want to know what we're doing with that. So we're pulling from a variety of folks and perspectives and identities. And so with that being said, I have ultra liberal families, and I got an email from a woman who was really upset. This was a parent of a student who actually was a student here and graduated in Alexis's class, and was really angry with the institution because we, during the election of President Trump, that she was really unhappy and wanted the school to do more, and the school didn't do more like she thought that we should have. She felt like we should have had a day of mourning. He emails me after the second book study and says, I feel like earshot is like my girlfriend telling me how it is and like calling me out for my views. And then we have some folks respond like, earshot's kind of like that aunt who's just going to keep it real and like tell me what I need to hear. And I think those comments are so hilarious because many of those folks came in thinking, all right, like this is going to be it. Irshad Manji is going to be on my side, whether they are familiar or not. And they're having to sit and ponder and be still and do some of that inner work that's so important to diversity. But oftentimes we want to tear down the system and fix the communities and do all of this. And what the book has called folks to do was to do that self-check. And before you can show up for all of that out there, you need to look inside of you. And so the reviews have been from Earshot's my aunt to I want Earshot to be my girlfriend. It's been great.
Where were all these fans all my life? But there must be some pushback. I mean, because you can't win them all. So, right. I mean, what complaints have you received? Honestly.
Some of the complaints have been, is Earshot contradicting it? So I obviously read and facilitate the book, so I'm very familiar. There's a chapter about, you don't call it sociopathic media.
Yes, I call social media sociopathic media, yes.
And the pushback of so it was a great dialogue we had our last discussion where it was, is Earshot contradicting herself? Well, tell me more. So is she, by not saying that we should engage with folks on social media who are trolling and being negative, is she not inviting people in? And we had a great conversation about dialogue. And if you're showing up, and this was right after the insurrection, so for folks who were showing up on the Capitol, for example, and bringing weaponry, were they there to protest? Or were they there to communicate? Or were they there for something more? And so we had a great conversation about that. So that goes back in a full circle moment of equipping yourselves with tools to engage and being able to recognize at the end of the day what it is that I'm participating in. And if it is a conversation where two people are going to talk, and okay, that's one thing. If it's violence and you're bringing a gun or a knife or whatever weapon to a dialogue, so it was a great conversation. And, that was a pushback. Another pushback was, well, wait, we're not going to talk about anti-racism. It's not that we're not talking about anti-racism. And I think that could possibly be a misconception. I want to get to anti-racism. I want to wake up. I want to not be fragile. And all of that is there in the tools. And so being able to clearly articulate that as a strategy to get there, I think has been really important and helpful. And
Interesting. Wonderful, wonderful. So even when the pushback comes, people who are participating in this book study are gaining the tools to actually engage about it rather than simply dig in their heels, become defensive, roll their eyes, snap their fingers, and walk away.
Yeah, because you're modeling in this facilitated discussion the essence and practice of the work. And so and I mix the groups up, so we have both sides of the spectrum modeling what it looks like to have a dialogue. So it's great.
That's
and
wonderful.
It's cross-generational too, I should. Right. So we have the Alexises with the elderly.
Wait a minute. That means you're calling me ultra elderly. And you know what? As long as you attach the word wise to that, I don't mind.
Good.
Okay, but otherwise, don't label me. One question that jumps out at me right away, and there are other questions, we will get to them, that have already been tabled, but one that jumps out at me right away is this. Can you succinctly describe the difference between what you characterize as anti-racism in contrast to moral courage? If the questioner doesn't mind, I'd like to take the first shot at drawing a succinct distinction, because you're right, questioner, there is a big difference. My experience with anti-racism education is that it very much operates on the paradigm of us versus them. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'm going to draw a picture for everybody to just kind of imagine in their heads, okay? Think of two rival teams on a field, whatever game they're playing, whether it's football, whether it's whether it's soccer, whatever. One team is wearing the jersey called powerful, and the other team is wearing the jersey labeled powerless. Anti-racism as an educational approach is only interested in having those teams switch out the jerseys so that the team that was once called powerful now wears the jersey of powerless. And the team that was once called powerless now wears the jersey of the powerful. In the picture that I've just sketched, questioner, notice that all that's happened is that the uniforms have been swapped out. The game has not changed. The game is still us against them. Moral courage aspires to change the game, not just the uniforms, the game. By dissolving this assumption, and it goes exactly back to what Alexis has been telling us, dissolving this assumption that just because you're white and I'm a person of color, you are powerful and I am powerless. You are the oppressor and I am the oppressed. Sorry, no. In the wise words of Alexis, the world is so much more complex than that. What if the so-called white person also comes from poverty? What if that person's family has a history of addiction? What if that person's family comes from a history of genocide, meaning that they were, slaughtered, as of course we all knew a generation of Jews was, incinerated. The point being that just by looking at somebody does not mean you know them, or for that matter, their story. And yet, the us against them model that so much anti-racism work is based on does make those assumptions. Moral courage changes the game by making engagement a core principle of being morally courageous. Now, I'll say one other thing about all of this. Why moral courage? Why even that phrase? Here's why. Moral courage simply means doing the right thing in the face of your fears. Okay, think about that phrase, doing the right thing in the face of your fears. Now, you might rightly be asking, well, in a polarized society like ours is, what is the right thing? My right is somebody else's abominable. Hold on, though. We're going to get to what is the right thing in just a second. Let's talk about what we as human beings fear. Behavioral science repeatedly shows that what we fear more than anything else is being judged, being shamed and blamed, especially by people within our own group. Which is why in just about any given situation, most of us will just go with what our group is telling us to do. We will lapse into group think. Instead, in a free society, what we ought to be doing is proactively encountering, exposing ourselves to different points of view. Yes, points of view that will challenge, but in that case will also clarify whether we are doing the right thing. And even if we are doing the right thing, it's right to be against racism. It's absolutely right. But here's the thing, by exposing myself to different points of view, I will also realize whether the way I pursue my discouragement of racism is the best way. So that I believe that if more progressive people, for example, so-called progressive people, right, listened to different points of view, they would see that finger wagging, scorning, shaming is not the best way to defeat racism, because those kinds of tactics humiliate. And when other people feel humiliated, they become more defensive. So you can see why the moral courage method is not just a method for defeating real injustices in our society, but it's a method for how to do so in a way that does not create more injustices along the way, right? I sometimes think about it, questioner, this way. Moral courage is the MLK way. Anti-racism is the Mao how, as in Mao Zedong, communist leader of China. The Mao how on the one hand and the MLK way on the other. Does either of you, Alexis, Raquel, have anything more to add about what you see as the difference between the anti-racist approach and the moral courage method?
Just as the person who leads it and structures it and it has implemented it on campus for me, the only thing I would add, and which was important, I can talk to students all day, and I do, and I program out things all day, and I do with adults and with families. But at the end of the day, just like in every other discipline and every other core thing we're trying to provide students, I need an outcome and I need a how to do it. And so, you know, I can, and I have like broken down and dissected various philosophies, and there's a place for that. But I'm responsible for moving my community forward and equipping students to grow. And so I need a how. And moral courage gave me an action step how that the language and the work we've implemented with students, and we're excited about the opportunities and possibilities for adults, but it answered the how in a deliverable way that was something that my institution can grasp and implement. And this is even from young folks, and I've shared in work, we're a high school, but I've partnered with a middle school, even in regards to middle school work and those in that group of students, it was, okay, can we read this? Can we read this? But let's do. And so moral courage was a do that the students really bought into. And Alexis made, it wasn't a sell, like Alexis, we're gonna do moral courage. What is that? And then it stayed with her. And oftentimes those buzzwords and that's just yet another thing that goes by wayside. And now we're what, like 4 years removed, Alexis, because you were a junior in high school when you experienced that, and you're still here, moral couraging it up, you know?
I would also say that the phrasing of anti-racist, right? If there's one thing my generation is most fearful of, is being labeled. Especially with words with a heavy connotation like being a racist, right?
Mhm.
And usually when someone is labeled that, they instantly either get very defensive or they shut down. And I think at this point in our time, yeah, there are definitely people who exist who are racist, right? And I think there's also this gray area of people who like might benefit from the systems of racism, but don't necessarily know how to approach what that means, and how to either stray away from that and use certain privileges to advantages, or also do the opposite where they're giving out in certain ways. And I think that gray area it includes multiple people, right? Not only white folks.
Right.
I think we were speaking the other day, and I was saying part of this healing is also the healing that we have to do within our own communities, right? And so there's a lot of certain like thinking that is not right per se, like within my own community and with other communities. And I think moral courage as a whole, it basically attacks, or not attacks, for lack of a word, but it encompasses the overall goal of what it should be to experience one another, which is essentially communicating so that we're trying to lessen how we're judging one another, right? And we're at a day and age where we know what racism is, we know the effects of it, everyone knows about it, right? And obviously, in some ways, other things could be changed, other things could be done. But ultimately, the biggest thing that moral courage does is that it gives you the tools to face not only racism, but let's say we were talking about homophobia. Let's say we were talking about xenophobia. And I think when we say anti-racist, we make it very secluded to one thing, when in reality, the thinking that should be applied to how we should think about, racist structures and homophobic structures and all these structures is actually universal.
Well, I love what you just say about that, Alexis, and I want to pick up on that as we transition to the next question. Something that really touches my heart about what you've picked up about regarding moral courage is that it doesn't just give you the tools to speak truth to power out there. It also gives you those tools to talk about injustice in your own community. Yeah. Like, for example, you say you raise the issue of homophobia. We all know that in my Muslim community, homophobia is rampant, but it's not fair for me to just, to lecture. First of all, it wouldn't lecture anybody, but to lecture, quote unquote, white people about homophobia, or the Christian community about homophobia, if I'm not willing to do the same within my own Muslim community, right? Like, just because we're people of color doesn't mean that we don't have biases, doesn't mean that we are angels, doesn't mean that we don't have prejudices. We do. And part of my issue with anti-racism as an approach is that it assumes and makes other people assume that only white people are the problem, when the reality is we as human beings treat one another badly.
And just one more thing where moral courage, I think the reason why it stuck with me the most was because even if I'm not thinking about the outside like layers, as an individual, right, moral courage still applies in the way in which I hold myself accountable, in the way in which I bet on myself and my endeavors and my goals. And I think that is why moral courage is so powerful, and it is because it first starts at the individual level, right? When I'm doing something that's wrong and there's no one else to hold me accountable, I need to do that for myself, especially because of my commitment as a leader to grow into the best version of myself. And, I think that it is an essential part to universal healing, right? And even when you are having these conversations, right, whether or not I have a conversation with someone, at the end of the day, the deciding factor is when that person's alone, like, and they're sitting by themselves and they're like, what did I learn today? And they reflect and they then decide, okay, I'm going to take these steps to change how I'm approaching myself as an individual. And I also think with anti-racism, like you were talking about the teams, I think there's less emphasis on the importance of your relationship in regards to yourself and that accountability and how it takes moral courage to sit there with yourself and be like, oh, I've been a little wrong, I need to change, that's a very hard thing to do. And moral courage teaches you that at its core. And I learned that when I was a junior in high school, right? And while I'm a little older, at the same time, I'm very young,
So old.
I'm very young. And so for me to learn this I'm sitting here humbly thinking, when I'm older, I'm already learning it at this age. When I am, a full-on adult, what am I going to be doing for my community, and how is my thinking going to be even more advanced, and that's very powerful to have this type of thinking while you're in middle school, while you're in high school. Like it's a wonderful foundation to start your adulthood, and it affects your relationships, your career, it's a chain of events, and that's why moral courage is a lot different than just an anti-racist curriculum.
And you see that, like, what you're seeing is strategic change. Like it's not this cookie cutter program that you implement in a community that will have like a 5-year shelf life, and the reading program, the SEL program, like many schools have adopted a program. But if you want strategic change that is embedded in the way kids talk in the classroom, that's embedded in your SEL program, that's embedded in your diversity program, what Alexis is saying is this is a lifelong skill that I have. She knows how to add, she knows how to write an analytical paper, she knows her chemistry breakdown, periodic table, and she knows how to implement moral courage strategies. And that is lifelong strategic change. Yeah. It's not a cookie cutter program.
And in a way, I guess you could say that it's teaching, because as much as I learned a lot of tangible things, I think moral courage is the beginning of a question of how are we teaching emotional intelligence in the classroom. And that's a really hard thing to grasp, but it's beautiful how it's being done.
Well, and the way I see it, I promise I'm moving on to the next question. The way I see it is that you're learning character. Yeah. And character is the one thing that nobody can take away from you, right? It's the one thing that'll stay with you and that you will continue to evolve, whatever the chapter of life that you're in. So beautiful. Thank you. Opportunities like this are really helpful for me to understand what kind of an impact the work is having on, as you say, individuals. And I don't know that without the opportunity to come together in this forum, I would have known this, about you, Alexis. So first of all, thank you, Philanthropy Roundtable. Now, let me get to a couple of other questions. And I know we're running out of time. So let me again try to address each of them quickly and then turn it over to the both of you. One of the questions is, how do we convince or engage other schools, Raquel, to choose moral courage when it's just so easy these days to be intimidated into choosing anti-racism as the approach? Intimidated because if you don't choose that, you must be a racist, right? So first of all, how do we engage, other educators about this? I'll give you a minute to try and answer that question.
So for me, what I've done is made sure that they understood that we're not doing anti-racism. We are talking about identity, and that's built into the system. But at the end of the day, what has worked well for the work that I do in my institution is making it a skill-based approach. And so I'm teaching students a skill. I'm designing around an outcome where students are going to be better listeners and communicators across thinking. And we talk about diversity of thought and that sort of thing. And this is a skill that is implemented not just in our isolated advisory program, it's a skill that we built in institutionally. And so for parents and for folks who are questioning that, providing them an opportunity in the book discussion was a great one, but watching it play out in our moral courage leaders and the work that they were doing on campus has and it got a lot of traction and momentum and has made that lane more attainable for other schools and institutions.
So when you speak with other educators, you emphasize the skills, yeah, that moral courage teaches.
Yep.
Yeah. And is it too early to know if that emphasis has an impact on other educators? Like, do you see any kind of a metaphorical light bulb kind of go off? Do they understand it better now, or, does it take them a while to kind of process that?
I don't think it's immediate, right? Nothing in diversity work is. We've been doing this for the past 3 or 4 years. I think this is our 4th year, really, if I might be off a year. And I have other schools in my area who are like, how is you get buy-in? What is that thing you do? And again, folks have had to look at diversity work differently in light of George Floyd in the summer. So I would say that schools now more than ever are hungrier for those steps. But we've been doing this at Lawrence Academy now for years. And so we've been able to see the difference in engagement, and I'm able to show that just in the work that we've been doing on campus.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Another question related to this is how do educators access the resources that we're talking about? Now, I'm going to address that in just a moment, but I have to first preface my response by noting a question that has come up in the chat a couple of times by somebody who seems a little bit annoyed by what she or he perceives as somehow soliciting or selling our products, resources, offerings to you donors. Please know that's not what we are intending to do in this forum. The Philanthropy Roundtable does indeed have a non-solicitation policy, but what we are here to also engage with donors about is how they can help make moral courage education accessible to other schools and indeed other school districts around the country. So no, questioner, we're not here to sell anything for you. And somebody else writes, I don't think it sounds like a sales pitch. Great, because that's not what it's intended to be. But you're here as a donor, presumably to also hear how you can help if you're interested in doing so. And that's what we want to also give you the ability to do. So that now leads me to the question of how do other educators access these resources? So as I mentioned in my Big Ideas talk, I do this work in collaboration with a nonprofit known as Let Grow. And this is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan not-for-profit that promotes independent thinking and emotional resilience among young Americans. And last year, as I said in my Big Ideas talk, we spent COVID year creating offerings from the Don't Label Me book study to the soon-to-be released online course for teachers who want to teach moral courage, this version of moral courage in their own classrooms. And there are other offerings that we have. Again, not for any of you donors to buy, but rather for you to know that moral courage is not just a message, it is a set of tools that we are wanting to get out into schools and into school districts. And so one of the things we're going to be spending 2021 doing is marketing the heck out of these offerings, because a lot of educators don't even know that an alternative to anti-racist education exists. But what we have found is that when educators do know that this alternative called moral courage exists, they're interested in finding out more. So one of the things, donors, that you can help with is, contributing to our ability to hire proper marketers, people who really know the education space in America, so that we can get the word out, and that as we get the word out, so that we can also distribute these resources to interested schools and school districts. One of my great aspirations, I don't mind telling you, is that when the online course is out in the spring, that superintendents of school districts will purchase hundreds, even thousands of seats or licenses for their teachers to use this course. And not every school district, of course, has the funds to do that. So if any donor here knows, has a relationship with schools and would like to offer them seats to this course, that's a way of contributing, is to fund these seats for the school you have in mind. And even, should you choose, to fund the school district to purchase these seats for hundreds, even thousands of teachers in the district itself. And I know that we have maybe 30 seconds left in the deep dive. So I'm going to turn it back over to Raquel, Alexis. What is the big takeaway that you hope people listening today will be thinking more about?
Alexis, you want to go?
Sure. I think for me, as a student, I'm still a student in college. The biggest takeaway is just, I think, and I hope by sharing my story and engaging in this conversation, you've seen the effects of how much moral courage has built my character and also my confidence in engaging in spaces that might not necessarily always include me, but me feeling comfortable enough to walk into those spaces and knowing that it'll get to that point.
That they will come to know you.
Yeah. And I think, it's about the effects of what it has on this generation, and moral courage is probably the reason why, I am one of the kids of my generation who is sitting here and is like, no, I have a lot to learn from a lot of different places, and I'm not right, and I don't have all the answers, and I'm willing to learn different things to come up with my own conclusions, right? Because as young adults, what usually drives our opinions are that of the people closest to us, right? Our parents, maybe our friends, whoever's raising you, and you don't begin to question that until you're away from them, right? And for some people, the first time that ever happens is if they go away to college, right? And even so, some people stay within their hometowns, right? And so moral courage introduces you to learning something different in the space that you're already in, right? Like, I didn't begin to learn different things until I was outside of New York, right? And part of that, I wasn't given the education, because if I stayed in New York in my poor neighborhood, I probably wouldn't have ever had access to moral courage, right? But I ended up being in a space that had the resources for that, and I was lucky and privileged enough to get that experience. And it really changed my life, and I've been someone who's been going through and having some pretty well successes in terms of internships, in terms of like starting my career at a young age, right? And I think there are so many people that I know who are extremely intelligent in my poor neighborhoods, right? But sadly, just haven't gotten the resources or the opportunities in their public schools, for instance, right? To get this type of education. And I think it was very life-changing for me. And I think it could possibly be very life-changing for many other people. And I'm not going to say that every kid who sits in a moral courage classroom is going to take away the same things that I did.
Right.
But I think even if 2, 5, a handful are able to, we're making a huge change already. And I really hope that's something that everyone will think about. Yeah.
You're a great ambassador. And I know that as I get older and start losing my marbles, maybe I already have, I'll be turning to you to become my moral courage mentor. Okay. Raquel, last word to you, 30 seconds.
No, just it's obtainable, and you can take philosophy of anti-racism and building community and put it in a skills-based way, to have a Alexis be out in the world, and who wouldn't want that?
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Philanthropy Roundtable, for bringing us together. And I hope that you leave today feeling inspired. Thank you.
Thank you.